20 years of fun, and hopefully this next 20 years will be as much fun. So the zombie economy. It's a cheap ploy, I know. We decided we do it because sort of looking at the numbers, looking at the data, one kind of sees that the economy is sort of, looks like it's recovery. The indicators are up, the GDP numbers have been positive. We've been in recovery since about July 2009. About 76 months of recovery, one of the longest post-war expansions this economy has gone through. Unemployment is down. We had some very record highs, about 10% in some instances. Now we're down about 5%. Great news. If you have purchased stock markets, the Dow Jones Industrials, you made out like a bandit. Wonderful news. If you drive an SUV, it's great news for you because gas prices are about $2 a gallon versus $4 a gallon several years ago. So there are numerous factors that make this economy seem like, wow, we're really in recovery. We should be happy, we should be doing cartwheels. And I won't do a cartwheel here, just FYI. I threatened with it, but I will not do it. But I think the important thing to recognize is all the numbers look very good. Now, I joke about a zombie economy that, is sort of lurching along. I can also call it a Monet economy. It looks great from a distance, but once you get really close to it, it's like, wow, it doesn't look so good. So let's start at the beginning. So, gross domestic product, recent data showed it growed about 1.1%, third quarter GDP. A little anemic. Historically we've grown about 2.5%, 3%. Recent data for the second quarter was about 3.9%. Much of that decline between the second and third quarter was due to investment falling, some deacceleration of exports, slowdown in personal consumption expenditures. So looking at our region here, you can see, and I'm with no notes, so I have a little crib sheet. Oops, this is my shopping list. But nevertheless, I will continue on. So looking at this, we broke up into three quarters, 2005, recession 2009, and then 2014. And we can kind of see Maryland and the Maryland flag, grew relatively great, about 4% in the pre-recession area. And then, negative growth in right in the recession. And then it's somewhat anemically recovered. And you can see our neighbors, Washington, Pennsylvania, Delaware, have sort of, not been growing as well. In each of these three periods, the states that led the growth were Nevada in the pre-recession. A lot of gambling, a lot of houses were driving that economy. They grew about 8%, 8.4%. Alaska grew wonderfully during the recession. Again, petroleum resources. They grew at about 7%. And then most recently, our favorite state to the north, North Dakota, grew in the post-recession period at about 6.3%. I imagine that number is going to probably go down pretty soon. So now, we're an economy driven by consumers. Sometimes we're an economy that is driven by, the fact that we see it, we want it, we buy it. And for the most part, that seems to be pretty good. We as an economy, everything is in the green in terms of indicators. Gas prices are down, as I said. The housing market has recovered to some degree, so people's wealth is somewhat restored. If you own stocks or equity, you're feeling much more wealthy. And when people feel wealthy or secure, they tend to spend money. So you can see our personal consumption expenditures here. Most recent data show personal consumption expenditures grew about 1.7%, third quarter. And we're looking at a very optimistic Christmas at about 3.5%, which is much higher than the 10-year average of 2.5%. So optimistically, it looks like we're basically an economy that has revved up its consumer engine, and consumers account for 70% of the economic activity. So it seems like it would be fair to say that there seems to be some optimism in there. Interest rates, record lows. You can get a mortgage now at 3%. Housing values, as I mentioned, have gone up, so people feel a bit more secure. But there's a little bit of fly in the ointment. So here's a bar chart that we broke down in durable, non-durable, and personal services. Pre-recession, during the recession and post-recession. Now the red bars are obviously, hopefully people recognize as the during the recession expenditures. And you can see that expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and household services declined during the recession tremendously. You can see our activity in black before the recession, and you can see that how much larger they are. Now you can see the recovery in gray. You can see we're significantly less. So even though we are spending more money, we're not spending as much money as we did prior to the recession. So our spending has slowed down, and that shows up in the numbers, especially the GDP numbers. People talk about the fact that, GDP growth, and many politicians promise 4 or 5 or 6 or 7% growth, but really what it boils down to is consumers, households, have to be willing to spend the money. If they're not confident in the economy, if they're not confident in their wealth or their prospects, they might not spend as much money. And here we have an example that maybe people aren't as confident. They're spending money, but not at the same rate as they were before the recession. Look at the Case-Shiller household, price index. People have been watching this fanatically. You can sort of see the, pre-recession levels of households, and then the dramatic drop down, and then basically a slow crawl back up. It's great news. We're, almost at pre-recession levels in terms of our housing values. Now, it's been a bit mixed. There's been some areas where it still continues to be sort of, a challenge in terms of home values, but nevertheless, home values on the whole have sort of risen. And here's the thing that people looked at. So pre-recession, almost a third of the homes were underwater in the mortgage. So 1 in 3 homes were underwater in the mortgage. You can see that number has come down rather tremendously to something below 20%, which is good. 15% to be precise. Now the Baltimore region still sort of a bit higher than usual. Some of that might be, again, driven by the fact that our foreclosure process takes a little bit longer than usual because of the administrative process. But you can see that basically consumers looking at this would realize, hey, my house may not be underwater. I can check Zillow.com and see what my housing price is worth. I can go get a new mortgage. I can get refinanced. I can spend money. Definitely a great improvement. Now condos, unfortunately, still remain the bugaboo. 20% of condos nationwide are underwater. Now, here's a great piece of news. If you drive an SUV, you're saving money. Now, if you drive the average car, 30 miles per gallon, 12,000 miles a year, there's about $800 a year savings in your pocket. So that's great news. And if you drive a car that gets worse gas mileage or more mileage, this is even better news. You've just received a huge gain in income. So this is great news for consumers and households. Now, obviously people are spending less on gasoline, their mortgage rates have dropped, their home values have increased. It's great news. But here is a sort of an interesting picture. We looked at sort of the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. And as you can see, it's gone down. But the participation rate remains at its lowest. In fact, it is right here. It's at 62.4% of the workforce is actually engaged in the labor force. Now, I should point out that that number was not achieved back until October 1977, 38 years ago. And the highest achieved was about 67.2%. That was achieved in the late 1990s when the economy was just booming, when the internet bubble it's about to burst. That's when we had the highest level of participation. So a 5 percentage point decline in overall participation rate. And moreover, it sort of accelerated these last couple of years. Again, I would say maybe the Xbox advent has sort of encouraged many young people not to generally jump into the labor force until the next new game comes out. But nevertheless, I would argue this is sort of a continuing ongoing problem. And while many politicians argue that we're actually at 38% unemployment, I would argue that we're really at 5%, but some people have necessarily chosen not to be in the labor force for obvious reasons. Maybe perhaps want to be a stay-home parent, have retired or just don't need to work. But nevertheless, we do have a fairly low participation rate compared to historical averages, and the highest has been about 67.2%. So if you put that in perspective, it is a decline. But if you think our labor force is about 150 million individuals, 5% of those individuals, about 7.5 million individuals, are not in the labor force that they were before, prior to the collapse. Now, one of the reasons that might be driving this is sort of the quality of jobs that are available. we've seen a rise in the sort of the part-time workforce. I would call it the gig workforce, and some might call it the gig workforce. But right now, pre-recession, 14% of the workforce worked in part-time jobs. During the recession, about 20% of the jobs available were part-time work. It's gone down to about 16%. Nevertheless, we still have a large portion, 2 percentage points, of individuals are working in sort of in part-time work than before. Underemployment, as you can sort of see, that sort of looks at that big picture. Underemployment is that area in black, and it shows basically how much that thing has gone. Now you can see pre-recession, that area looks a little bit smaller. Then post-recession, it's gotten smaller, but has gotten smaller as it was prior to the recession. So individuals are working in jobs, in part-time jobs, when they really want to work in full-time jobs. Unfortunately, the types of jobs that are available aren't necessarily those types of jobs. And you can sort of see for our state and region, the underemployment and the employment, and you can see Maryland, they're at 5.3% unemployment and 4.3% underemployment. So a large number, a little bit above the average or below the average in the unemployment rate, and below the average in terms of the underemployment rate. But you can sort of see that it's a fairly good number. Surprisingly, DC had a high unemployment rate but a very low underemployment rate. Now, we've often talked about the quality of jobs. Now, one thing that's been kind of going on, and I didn't really mention it before, an absence, a slip of the mind, was we've talked about all these great things, gas prices going down, interest rates staying low, home values accelerating, Dow Jones Industrials, going up. If you're in the equity markets, you've done well. We haven't talked about wage growth. It's been rather non-existent, maybe 0.1% at most. And I would argue that some of that's being driven by the fact that the types of jobs we're creating. On this chart here is 3 types of jobs we've broken up by high income, middle income, and low income. You can see the black area is the pre-recession growth in each of those sectors, and then the red area is the post-recession recovery. One thing to note is, yes, we did create some high-wage jobs. We basically, gained back all the jobs we lost in the middle income, but we gained a lot more jobs in the low-income areas. And that sort of is a bit concerning. So if you look at sort of the makeup of the jobs, a lot of them unfortunately tend to be much more low income than they were prior to the recession. And for Maryland, it's the same. In fact, it's even worse. We never recovered back all the jobs we lost in the middle income. We only gained back about 22,000. But we gained a whole lot more low-wage jobs. So we have an individual, now we did gain a lot of high-wage jobs, but unfortunately the low-wage jobs and the loss of the middle-income jobs sort of outweighs the gain back in high-wage jobs. So, when we look at sort of Maryland's recovery, if you're in the high-wage industries, you've done very well for yourself. If you've done low wages, you've not done so well. Now, in spite of all this, people feel good about the economy, not necessarily about themselves, hence the rise in plastic surgery. So, if you can't fix it, improve it. So you can see pre-recession, our spending was pretty robust in the plastic surgery areas. Obviously, when your home value falls down, you can't get the necessary surgery to make you feel better about yourselves. You don't spend it. And then post-recession, boom, once everyone realized that they could do that. So, total spending on plastic surgery, and this is elective surgery. This is not sort of the requirement of due to an accident or whatnot. This is purely elective. So, consumption, sort of a mixed bag. It seems to be that consumers are fairly happy, but there are some nagging things in the back of their minds. The job quality isn't there. Though they are able to save money on gas and they see their home values go up, they just perhaps don't feel quite confident. In fact, some people are voting by not participating in the labor market. Looking at our next sort of fun topic is investment. Sort of looking at national level investment, private domestic investment. This tends to be very volatile. And again, a lot of this is driven by sort of inventories that kind of come and go, replacement of durable machineries, durable machines, those type of things. So you can sort of see, here we sort of have this mixed bag. You can see our gross private domestic investment, obviously during the recession took a massive hit, and then it's sort of gradually picked up. In fact, some of the early quarters of our recovery were driven by the growth in inventories as firms replenished their stock to basically, allow consumers to buy goods and services. And you can sort of see, federal funds rate, you can sort of see in the 1980s, the era of good music and high interest rates. You can see basically how high interest rates were. You can also see now how low they are now. Now this is troubling in many senses. So there's a first sense of firms, basically can now borrow money at very low rates to kind of keep them going. Some call this sort of the zombie effect, that basically firms can just borrow cheap money and just keep them going or do stock buybacks or what have you. From a policy perspective, this zero rate interest rate environment means basically there is no monetary tool left to correct for any sort of downturn. Now while I said we have 76 months of great growth, like all good things, it must come to an end at some point. The fun part is predicting when the end is upon us. But you can sort of see that the tools that the Fed would have to help sort of adjust that, to help mitigate that problem, are no longer available. You can't lower interest rates any lower than zero, aside from just giving away for free. So that is a bit of a concern in the economy. Now you can sort of see manufacturers' new orders of durable goods. Now you might ask, Daraius, is that a mistake up there, a spike? Actually, people bought a lot of airplanes in that time period. So we also saw a huge spike up. You can sort of see the volatility that number will throw. That probably also threw our GDP numbers off that same time period as well. So manufacturing new orders of durable goods, again, a component of investment, very volatile number, but you can see the precipitous drop in the recession. Manufacturing output versus unemployment, and again, you can sort of see what happened to employment. Now, much of this recovery in manufacturing, until recently, was driven by exports. People want to buy Caterpillar trucks, people want to buy Boeing airplanes, very big ticket items, people want to buy Jeep Cherokees and whatnot, very big ticket items. You can sort of see that in spite of the fact that relatively flat growth of employment in manufacturing, we still grew, our output still grew. Now you can sort of see most recent data shows a bit of a drop-off, so a bit of a concerning is sort of going on. That might be driven by the fact that the world economy might be weakening a little bit. And you can sort of see the change in private inventories, basically how volatile they are up and down. And again, in response to sort of changes in the economy, as firms basically stock up for Christmas and whatnot, we begin to see these sort of spikes up and down. Housing starts, again, we're back almost to the pre-recession levels in terms of going back down, but we're still very low as compared to pre-recession. Very, very low, about almost half the rate of housing starts. Again, this is going to be part of the investment process as well. Now, I wanted this slide here to kind of look. So we were talking about, China is one of our biggest trading partners, it's always in the news, and we have this challenge. But looking at this graph here, you can see this is private investment in real estate. Now, at the peak of our bubble, about 9.1% of our GDP was focused investing in real estate. We have nothing on China in terms of how much money they're pouring into real estate. It's almost 1/5 of their GDP is focused on real estate. Now, what does that result in? Ghost cities. 12 to 24 new cities are built in China each year. Many of them are completely empty. It's become a sort of an investment hobby for many middle-class individuals to invest in homes or real estate in China. There was an article in NPR a couple weeks ago about an airport, a beautiful airport built in far away in a northwest region of China. Probably had 10 people. They probably had 3 flights every week or something of that nature. A very, very low amount of flights, but a beautiful, gleaming new airport that might even put BWI to shame in terms of its newness, modernity, and whatnot. So China's economy is pouring lots of money into infrastructure, and sometimes it's misspent, as sort of indicated by here. They're building empty apartment flats for soon to be no one. So we've talked about investment. It's very volatile. It's been going up and down. Some of that investment has been resulted in manufacturing output going to firms here who produce then goods and goods for abroad. Now we talk about the government. In this region, the government is very important. We have a large percentage of our workforce, as well as our GDP, tied to the federal government, as well as state and local. We've had some challenges: budget cutbacks, sequestration, all those things sort of buffeted the federal government spending. We've had threatened shutdowns. We've had threatened debt limit ceiling issues. It makes it for a very difficult environment for a business to plan how they're going to basically do their business, especially with the federal government, especially here in Maryland and or Virginia. So this is sort of, if we go back to the sort of a couple of slides ago, we talked about regional GDP. You can see that both Virginia and Maryland's GDP post-recovery was very, very low compared to basically its neighbors, Pennsylvania and Delaware, but more importantly, even compared to the national average. So this is somewhat scary. And you can sort of see here government spending. Now, that mountain in the middle is a stimulus spending that took place. Now, many would argue that, well, that was a sort of a foolish expenditure, but I would argue that probably we underspent. We probably should have spent more, and we probably had a better earlier recovery. But nevertheless, ifs and buts. But nevertheless, you can sort of see in how low it's become. We're almost just a little bit above what we were pre-recession, but nevertheless, we have come down precipitously in terms of government spending. Now, you can sort of look at what our region, sort of a share of federal, state, and local government. You can sort of see that Maryland and D.C. and Virginia have a large share of their GDP attached to the federal government in terms of sort of its output. Considerable amount. Now, we're nowhere near what D.C. is, but we're much higher than what Virginia is. You can sort of see the federal surplus or deficit as a percent of GDP. You can see on the slide where the stimulus package took place, and you can sort of see the recovery as it lowers the deficit. Now, unfortunately, debt is cumulative. So we have, during the recovery, we piled on some deficits, which then piled onto our debt, which resulted now in our debt now exceeding our GDP. So we're above 100% of our GDP. Now, what does this mean? This means that there's no fiscal package available for us. We have a very conservative Senate, a very conservative House. It's going to be very difficult, should the downturn occur, for any policy tools available. There is no stomach for raising the debt. Obviously we've had some battles about raising the debt limit, but more importantly, imagine if you will, to raise spending in a Congress that's Republican dominated going forward. I don't imagine 2016 will bring much change to the Congress, both House and Senate, regardless of whomever occupies the household, making America great, or whomever. But nevertheless, this means there really is no fiscal policy tools. You can only lower taxes, but taxes sort of are a great thing to lower, except if people don't spend their money. Because remember, our economy is driven by 70% of consumer spending. If households feel as if there is bad prospects ahead, they're going to take that money they get in the tax cut, suck it in their bank account. Now that's great for banks because banks now have money to loan. However, if businesses don't have any customers, they can't borrow the money. So we really don't have any good effective tools now left, given our political climate, given the fact we're in a zero rate interest rate environment, and we have basically a debt above 100% of our GDP. So the challenge will be, when the next president comes in, as we enter into a downturn, likely, given sort of the cyclical nature of our economy, that there are no policy tools, that our recession will probably likely be deeper, longer than it was prior years. That's the good news. Just kidding. So you can sort of see federal employment here in Maryland, about 5.1% of our workforce, 5.9% of our workforce is related to the federal government. 148,000 individuals here in Maryland work for the federal government. In Virginia, it's 182,000. So a significant amount of our workforce is engaged with the federal government. Now, we can't look for the federal government for growth. This is not going to be a growth industry going forward. There may be a few selected areas such as cybersecurity or whatnot, but typically speaking, we're not going to see massive growth in federal government spending in the near term. And you can sort of look at Maryland, and we can sort of see that we do have a budget surplus, which is good. We're still working on the structural deficit, so it is good. So again, Maryland is probably going to be cutting back its spending, and we can sort of see that with the new Governor Hogan, reducing fees on tolls, reducing some taxes and fees. So that's going to mean that we're going to have less. So Maryland state government is probably not going to be spending as much money as they once had. And you can sort of look at our defense spending. With 2 wars winding down, we're not spending as much money. Now, obviously, it's sort of dipped to its lowest thing in 2013, and it's sort of somewhat risen, but nevertheless, it's still lower than it was in 2004, defense spending. So, as this winds down, there's less defense spending. Now, this affects Maryland significantly because we have a lot of military installations in Maryland. A lot of money. So total impact, if we do all the ancillary impacts of the induced, indirect, 410,000 individuals are indirectly or induced or directly employed by the military installations here in Maryland. They have an output of $57.4 billion. Huge, huge amount. Our total GDP for Maryland is around $250 billion. So you can imagine basically how big this number is. So a significant amount of our economy here is not only tied to the federal government, but also tied to its military installations, which are 17 around in Maryland. Now, one of the final topics here is net exports, the area in red. So we've pretty much kind of said, well, consumers might be spending more money, they may not be. Obviously, on plastic surgery, hands down, they are spending money on that. Investment, is iffy back and forth. Government is definitely probably not going to be a big spender going forward. So net exports here, trade, as we say, is an important component. About 11% of our total GDP is probably about net exports. And you can sort of see that area highlighted sort of shows the change. Now you can sort of see as net exports became less negative, and net exports, by the way, is imports minus exports. So typically in our long history, probably 1974, 73 was the last time we had a positive trade surplus, a positive net export, excuse me. And you can sort of see it's dipped as low as $800 billion and has gone as high as minus $400 billion. And a lot of that was driven by the fact that our goods were selling abroad. We had a very cheap dollar. What's happened? If you go to a trip to Europe now, the euro has weakened against the dollar. The Japanese currency has weakened against the dollar. The Chinese currency has also weakened against the dollar. The Chinese economy has sort of stumbled a bit. The Japanese economy was announced that it was in a recession again yesterday. Europe still hasn't recovered from its recession. So our growth potential from net exports is somewhat limited. There is no sort of, we're going to go hope that the rest of the world will grow, and by the rest of the world growing, our exports will grow, and therefore our manufacturing will grow. We don't see that happening. In fact, if you look at this number over here, our net exports have become much more negative. As we become better off, we're importing more, which is great, but we're exporting less to the rest of the world. And you can sort of see the areas that we do, industrial goods, automotive, other. Education is a big thing that we export. Being in a university is one of the key exports here in the nation. There was an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal talking about many schools are importing or actually exporting their educational services by bringing in foreign students. Foreign students pay full freight in terms of tuition, and they help sort of alleviate some of the budget challenges that many universities face. But you can sort of see these are goods and services in our area, in the nation. And you can see our top trading partners. We did it by exports. Canada is our #1 trading partner for goods going out. Mexico #2, China #3, Japan #4, UK 5, Germany 6. Now the good news about this is somehow these countries have accepted our paper currency for their goods. It's remarkable. I mean, what a scam that is. I mean, you think about it. We're getting Datsuns, we're getting sort of Nissans, we're getting, all kinds of good stuff, and they're getting dollars, just paper dollars, backed by the full faith and credit of us, who I wouldn't trust any of you in this audience right now at all, but somehow the rest of the world has taken that, like, wow, so this isn't like printing money. So when people talk about, oh, we're running this trade deficit, the Chinese are winning, I say, wait a minute. We're getting goods, and we're giving them paper. It's great. Now, from a point of view from jobs, we want to export more goods to the rest of the world. But in terms of, well, is this good or bad, it really, it depends on which way you stand. If you're buying cheap goods and getting paper and getting durable goods in return, it's probably a pretty good deal. Netherlands is one of our oldest trading partners, pre-Revolutionary War. We do want a budget surplus with the Netherlands. In legal goods, by the way, nothing illegal that we're importing from the Netherlands. Belgian beer, obviously, Brazil, we're doing, and obviously Korea South, not yet broken into the Hermit Kingdom yet. Maryland, we trade a lot with it's like Canada, Saudi Arabia, China, Egypt as key ones, and the UK. Very good. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, so surprisingly, we export a lot of aircraft parts to Saudi Arabia, one of our key exports. And you can sort of see the growth in Maryland as it's done. And you can sort of see below this, you've got Korea, Japan, and Vietnam as trading partners. You can sort of see why when Governor Hogan went to Asia, he hit those countries basically to renew our strength in those countries. Now, Maryland, Baltimore region, we've really been focusing and sort of kind of figuring out, well, prior to this little bit of a downturn, there is still potential for economic growth in the export market, maybe not this year or next year, but in the long term. Right now we're positioned as 28th in the nation of the 100th largest metro in terms of total export value. Surprisingly, our best exports are education. We've got 16 great universities, Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, Towson University, for example. Here in the region, we have a lot of foreign students attending. That is an export. We have a lot of individuals coming here for healthcare from abroad. World-class hospitals, Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, Franklin Square. We've got tourism, information technology, and manufacturing. We're 6.9% of our exports in this region, 6.9% of our GDP are exports. That puts us about 90%, 90th and 90th quartile in terms of the total of the top 100. And we export to Europe, Asia, and Canada. So you can sort of see the strengthening dollar. So if you're planning a trip abroad, the euro is falling, so now you can buy more European stuffs, enjoy more German bratwurst, more French wine, more English beer than ever before. Excuse me, I take that back, not English beer, it's on the pound still. And again, with China and Japan, we're also seeing the dollar is strengthening relative to those currencies. Again, making our exports more expensive. And again, with a decline in Japan and a decline in China, the export market in the short term is going to be challenging. So we get consumption, we might have a good Christmas. See it, buy it, see it, want it, buy it. Investment, it's going to be up and down depending upon how the Christmas season goes, depending upon the strength of the export marketing goes. Government spending, we expect to see that to kind of taper off, level. In fact, probably expect employment in government to sort of decline as people retire and those positions aren't filled. And the export market, again, is driven by forces beyond our control, which could be currency fluctuations as well as economic conditions in those host countries. So, forecast. A little ominous music. Every year people say, well, how close were you last year? So we were fairly close last year in terms of our forecasting. So I feel confident with what I'm presenting here. So looking at employment, we can see it's probably sub 2% growth overall. Probably in 2018, we expect to see some continued decline below about 1%. Long-term prospects, so we'll probably have a couple of good years, and then we might have some dip-de-doos going forward. Nevertheless, personal income, again, here in Maryland, we have a lot of wealthy households that derive income from the capital market, from equity markets. Again, so in spite of wages not increasing, if you were in the equity markets, you did do very well, and therefore your capital gains are reflected in this. And typically speaking, 5% is typically normal for Maryland. We're running a bit below long term. We did some wage employment growth. You can sort of see construction. And again, we looked at last year's, and we were spot on with employment. Obviously, manufacturing information is suffering as usual. Again, we're doing more with less in the case of manufacturing. And you can sort of see the usual suspects. Healthcare is typically good. Educational services, professional and technical services typically have done fairly well. Administrative waste management. This is not Tony Soprano doing the job. This typically is the sector that captures the temporary workers. So if you see administrative waste management, don't think of Tony Soprano, think of the temp as the number behind that. Accommodation of food services, in spite of what the numbers report for Baltimore, we expect that area to sort of continue to show some signs of improvement. Now, there's something new we added this year. We looked at wages by industry, and you can see they're running around below 3 or 4%, nothing sort of too spectacular. Manufacturing tends to be low, again, fewer people, but you're paying them more. Transportation and warehousing, all good. Now, many of you see that we're all sporting some flair here. I don't have 15 pieces of flair, by the way. I just have 3 pieces. But we have the PROM, which is our predictive regional occupational matrix. So we sort of figured that maybe sometimes people look at the industry employment gains and say, that's great, except what does it mean for administrative assistant? What does it mean for construction manager? So through the hard work of our senior economist, Ms. Susan Stewart, we built a matrix that accompanies our forecasting tool that allows us then to sort of predict what the 10 occupations of growth will be. Now, mind you, for each industry, we can actually drill down. So for that prior page, and for the next 3 hours, I will present in excruciating detail each industry. So this is, just sit back, write it out. You might want to, we're serving alcohol here, right? You can sort of see where the occupations are going to be given sort of the industry growth patterns that we're predicting. And you can sort of see we go from construction managers, pharmacy technicians, computer users, software developers. I mean, today with computer users, you can definitely see amongst my generation, we're completely helpless in terms of that. So we definitely need more IT support. And it goes on. These are only the top 10. I was only kidding. I'm not going to go through every single industry, but you see medical assistants, health, safety engineering, except for the mining. We don't worry about coal miners anymore, apparently. Elementary, middle school teachers. Also these areas where we think the occupational growth based upon our industry forecast. So, with that, the final slide, the zombie guide, survival guide. Now, oftentimes, Baltimore is in the top 10 list for very bad things. Not in this case. Baltimore is number 4 to survive the zombie apocalypse. This is great news. Ahead of us is Boston, Salt Lake City, Columbus, and Baltimore. Below us is Virginia Beach. Who cares? So we will survive the zombie apocalypse. Cities that won't survive, are New York, Tampa, Los Angeles, Riverside, and Chicago. So when the zombie apocalypse hits, which it will hit soon, we're number 4. So get your go bag ready. But I think what it shows the resiliency. This is sort of done as tongue-in-cheek, but it does show the resiliency of the local economy to sort of, major sort of events. And I think Baltimore, does show that it has some strong resiliency and some deep roots that it can sort of survive. And with that, thank you very much for your rapt attention.